Hi, dear friends, how are you? Today I'm going to tell you about why we're psychopaths. So happy in the crazy Middle Ages? Grab your coffee and get ready to listen. First of all, please subscribe to my channel and leave a comment. There is a question that occasionally surfaces in popular psychology and popular history alike. A question that asks whether the particular cluster of traits modern science associates with psychopathy, traits including fearlessness, ease, striking lack of anxiety, charm, ruthlessness, and a diminished capacity for empathy, might have been more richly rewarded in the medieval world than they generally are today. It is a genuinely interesting question, and one that deserves to be answered with real care. Because the word psychopath itself belongs to modern clinical psychology, developed and refined across the 20th century, and applying it directly to people who lived 7 or 8 centuries ago carries real risk of anachronism, of projecting a modern diagnostic category backward onto a world that understood human cruelty, ambition, and violence through an entirely different framework. What we can responsibly explore, and what this account sets out to do, is not to diagnose any particular historical figure, since no reliable psychological diagnosis can be made of a person who has been dead for centuries and left behind no clinical record of their inner life. What we can explore, grounded in genuine historical evidence, is the surrounding social and cultural structure of medieval Europe itself, and ask a more answerable question. Which particular human traits did medieval society, across its warfare, its politics, its religion, and its everyday violence, tend to reward, and which traits did it tend to punish? In doing so, we can understand why certain modern psychologists have argued that a person carrying the traits associated with psychopathy today might, under medieval conditions, have found a world considerably more accommodating to their nature than the one most of us inhabit now. Chapter 2: What Psychopathy Actually Means. Before exploring medieval society itself, it is worth pausing on what psychopathy actually describes within modern psychology, since the term is often used loosely in popular culture in ways that depart considerably from its clinical meaning. Psychopathy, as understood by contemporary researchers, describes a constellation of personality traits, including a profound lack of empathy and remorse, superficial charm, manipulativeness, impulsivity, a diminished experience of fear and anxiety, and a persistent pattern of disregard for the rights and well-being of others. It is generally understood by psychologists as existing on a spectrum, rather than as a simple category a person either does or does not belong to, and only a relatively small proportion of people who display some of these traits would meet the fuller clinical threshold researchers associate with the term. Crucially, psychopathy, as currently understood, is believed to arise from a combination of genetic predisposition and early developmental factors, a pattern of neurological and psychological development that would have existed among human populations throughout history, medieval Europe, very much included, regardless of whether any medieval person possessed the conceptual vocabulary to describe or diagnose it in the way modern clinicians do. This distinction matters enormously for the argument this account explores, since the underlying human variation in fearlessness, empathy, and impulse control very likely existed among medieval people in roughly the same proportions we find in populations today, even though medieval society had no framework resembling modern clinical psychology through which to identify, understand, or manage it. Chapter 3: A World Without a Word for It. Medieval Europe possessed no equivalent concept to modern psychopathy, and this absence shaped everything about how a person with these particular traits would have been understood, judged, and treated by the society around them. Where a modern clinician might identify a diminished capacity for empathy or an absence of remorse as symptoms warranting evaluation and treatment, medieval thought, dominated overwhelmingly by a religious and moral framework centered on the Christian understanding of sin, would have interpreted the very same behavior through an entirely different lens, one concerned with virtue, vice, and the state of an individual's soul, rather than with any concept resembling a psychological disorder or a diagnosable personality structure. This meant that a person exhibiting what modern psychology would recognize as psychopathic traits was, in the medieval world, judged essentially by the same moral and legal standards applied to everyone else. Someone capable, in the eyes of medieval law and theology, of freely choosing good or evil, and therefore fully responsible for whatever cruelty or ruthlessness they displayed. There existed no medieval concept of diminished responsibility rooted in an underlying psychological condition, no framework through which a person's behavior might be understood as flowing from an inherent difference in emotional processing rather than a straightforward moral failing. This absence of any clinical or diagnostic lens carries real significance for the argument at the center of this account, since it meant that a person with pronounced psychopathic traits faced no medieval equivalent of psychiatric intervention, social flagging, or institutional management, specifically directed at their particular pattern of behavior, and was instead judged, rewarded, or punished according to the same practical, moral, and religious standards applied to the rest of medieval society. Chapter 4: A Society Organized Around Violence. Medieval European society, and particularly its ruling and warrior classes, was organized to a degree difficult for modern observers to fully appreciate around the practical necessity and cultural glorification of violence. The feudal system that structured landholding and political power across much of medieval Europe rested fundamentally on military obligation, with lords holding their land. In direct exchange for the military service, they owed their own superiors, and warfare, whether in the form of organized campaigns between kingdoms, more localized feuds between rival noble families, or the near-constant low-level violence of raiding and skirmish that characterized much of medieval political life, remained a persistent and expected feature of life for the medieval nobility. Within this warrior culture, traits that modern clinical psychology would recognize as psychopathic including a diminished experience of fear in combat, a willingness to inflict serious violence without hesitation or lingering guilt, and the cold, calculating pursuit of advantage, even at considerable cost to others, were not merely tolerated, but actively celebrated as martial virtue, particularly among the knightly class whose entire social identity and claim to status rested substantially on demonstrated capacity for violence. Chronicles and literary sources from across the medieval period repeatedly praise fearlessness in battle and a ruthless, unhesitating willingness to strike down an enemy, qualities that a modern workplace or community would very likely regard as deeply troubling warning signs, but that medieval society, structured as it was around the practical and cultural centrality of warfare, treated instead as markers of genuine excellence and honor. Chapter 5: Power Without Modern Restraint. The concentration of political and legal power within medieval society, particularly among the highest ranks of nobility and royalty, operated with far fewer institutional checks than those familiar to modern governance, and this concentration of largely unaccountable power created conditions under which the particular combination of traits associated with psychopathy, including ruthlessness, manipulativeness, and a genuine comfort with inflicting harm on others to achieve personal ends, could translate directly into sustained political and material success in a manner considerably more difficult to achieve within modern institutional structures, built with far more deliberate checks against exactly this kind of unrestrained individual power. A medieval ruler or powerful noble faced comparatively limited institutional accountability for cruelty directed at subjects, civils, rivals, or enemies, particularly when such cruelty could be framed, as it very often was, within the accepted logic of medieval warfare, feudal obligation, or the enforcement of legitimate authority. Surviving medieval legal and administrative records document numerous instances of severe punishment, calculated political betrayal, and violence deployed by medieval rulers against rivals and subjects alike, conduct that faced only the limited practical check of rival power, religious censure, or the eventual judgment of later chroniclers, rather than any of the more immediate institutional accountability mechanisms, including independent courts, a free press, or formal psychological and ethical oversight that constrain the exercise of power within most modern societies. This relative absence of restraint meant that a person whose psychopathic traits inclined them toward ruthless, self-interested exercise of power faced considerably fewer practical obstacles to acting on that inclination and considerably greater potential reward for doing so successfully than an equivalently disposed individual would typically encounter within a modern institutional context. Chapter 6: Charm, Charisma, and the Medieval Court. Modern research on psychopathy consistently identifies superficial charm and genuine social charisma as characteristic traits frequently found alongside the more overtly harmful features of the psychopathic profile, and this particular combination, the capacity to inspire genuine loyalty and affection even while pursuing coldly self-interested, and sometimes genuinely harmful ends, appears to have found a particularly receptive environment within the intensely personal, relationship-driven political culture of the medieval royal and noble court. Medieval political power depended enormously on the successful cultivation of personal loyalty, patronage networks, and carefully managed reputation, and the particular social skill often associated with the psychopathic personality profile, an ability to read and manipulate the emotional needs of others while remaining fundamentally unmoved by any genuine emotional investment of one's own, could translate directly into exactly the kind of successful, courtly maneuvering upon which medieval political advancement so heavily depended. Surviving accounts of medieval court life, preserved in chronicles, letters, and the occasional surviving memoir, frequently describe individuals whose remarkable personal charm and persuasive ability allowed them to secure position, favor, and advancement in ways that later observers, occasionally even contemporary ones, found difficult to reconcile with the genuinely ruthless or self-serving conduct these same individuals displayed once their position had been secured, a pattern broadly consistent with what modern psychology would recognize in the combination of charm, callousness at the center of the psychopathic personality profile, even though, as emphasized throughout this account, no specific historical individual can be reliably diagnosed with any clinical condition based on such indirect and centuries-old evidence. Chapter 7: Confession, Absolution, and the Path Around Guilt. The medieval Christian framework of sin, confession, and absolution offered a particular psychological and social mechanism that, whatever its genuine spiritual purpose, but the great majority of medieval believers may have provided a person with genuinely diminished capacity for remorse, a uniquely convenient path around the ordinary social and psychological consequences of guilt that constrain most human behavior. Medieval Christian doctrine held that even the gravest sin could be forgiven through sincere confession and appropriate penance, a theological structure that offered every medieval Christian, regardless of the particular psychological makeup underlying their behavior, a formal, socially sanctioned mechanism for addressing the aftermath of serious wrongdoing without necessarily requiring the genuine internal experience of remorse that modern secular society more often expects as evidence of authentic moral accounting. For a person whose psychopathic traits included a diminished natural capacity for guilt or remorse in the first place, this religious framework of confession and absolution may have provided a particularly efficient and socially acceptable substitute, allowing outward conformity of religious and social expectation, including the performance of appropriate penance, without requiring any of the genuine internal emotional processing that the same framework demanded, at least in principle, of ordinary believers. This is, admittedly, a more speculative extension of the broader argument this account explores, since thence the actual inner emotional experience of any medieval individual remains fundamentally inaccessible to historians working from surviving documentary evidence alone. But it represents a genuine line of reasoning advanced by some psychologists and historians studying the intersection of a medieval religious practice and the particular psychological profile associated with reduced capacity for guilt. Chapter 8, where modern psychology draws this argument from. The specific argument that psychopathic traits may have conferred generative, adaptive, and social advantage within particular historical contexts, including, but not limited to medieval Europe, has been advanced by a number of contemporary psychologists and researchers studying the evolutionary, social dimensions of personality variation, including work examining why traits associated with psychopathy have persisted within the human population across evolutionary time, despite their evident capacity for harm. Researchers working within this evolutionary psychological framework generally argue that traits such as fearlessness, ruthless pursuit of resources and status, and reduced empathetic constraint may have offered genuine reproductive and survival advantages within certain historical and social environments, particularly those characterized by frequent violence, weak institutional constraint, and social structures that rewarded dominance and ruthless competition for resources, conditions that plausibly characterized substantial portions of medieval European society, particularly among its warrior and ruling classes. This body of research does not claim, and this account does not claim, that medieval society was somehow uniquely populated by psychopathic individuals, nor that medieval people in general experienced the particular combination of traits associated with clinical psychopathy at rates meaningfully different from human populations at any other point in history. The argument is instead considerably more modest and precise, proposing that the particular social and institutional structure of medieval Europe, especially among its warrior and ruling elite, happened to create conditions under which the specific traits associated with psychopathy were more likely to translate into social success, status, and reproductive advantage than would typically be the case within the very different institutional and cultural conditions of most modern societies. Chapter 9. The limits of this argument. Any responsible account of this theory must give equally serious attention to its genuine limitations, and to the substantial body of legitimate scholarly skepticism it has attracted. The most fundamental limitation is one already emphasized throughout this account, that no reliable psychological diagnosis can be made of historical individuals' based on the necessarily incomplete, often biased, and frequently politically motivated documentary evidence that survives from the medieval period, meaning that any specific claim about the psychological makeup of a particular medieval ruler or noble remains, at that best, informed speculation rather than established historical. A further significant limitation concerns the risk of survivorship bias within the surviving historical record itself, since medieval chronicles and administrative documents disproportionately preserve information about rulers and nobles whose actions were considered significant enough to record, very often precisely because those actions involved dramatic violence, betrayal, or ruthless political maneuvering, potentially creating a distorted impression of how common such traits and behaviors actually were across the broader medieval population, the great majority of whom left no comparable documentary trace of their inner character or behavior at all. Additionally, many scholars caution against too readily importing a specifically modern clinical framework onto a historical society that understood human behavior, motivation, and morality through entirely different conceptual categories, arguing that describing medieval rulers or nobles through the lens of a 20th century psychological diagnosis risks obscuring more than it reveals about that the genuine, historically specific logic that shaped medieval violence, ambition, and cruelty on its own terms. Chapter 10: Punishment, Spectacle, and a Different Emotional Register. Medieval society's relationship to violence extended well beyond the battlefield and the political maneuvering of its ruling elite, encompassing a broader cultural comfort with public violence and physical punishment considerably more pronounced than that found in most modern societies, a difference that carries real relevance for understanding why traits associated with reduced empathic response may have faced less social friction within medieval daily life more generally. Public executions, corporal punishment, and various forms of judicially sanctioned violence formed a routine and widely attended feature of medieval town and village life. And surviving accounts suggest that such spectacles drew genuinely large crowds who witnessed considerable physical suffering as an accepted, unremarkable feature of the administration of justice, rather than as an event requiring any particular emotional distance or specialized psychological constitution to observe. This broader cultural normalization of witnessing, and, in various official capacities, personally administering serious physical violence and punishment meant that a person with a genuinely diminished capacity for empathic distress in the presence of others' suffering would have encountered considerably less social friction and required considerably less active suppression of ordinary emotional response within the routine texture of medieval public life than an equivalently disposed individual would typically encounter within the very different emotional and cultural norms of most contemporary developed societies, where direct exposure to serious physical violence and suffering has become both far rarer and far more socially marked as exceptional and disturbing. Chapter 11: A Question of Structure, Not of a Happier Past. It is worth closing this account by returning directly to the underlying premise from which it began and offering a genuinely important clarification. The available historical and psychological evidence does not support any claim that medieval people carrying the traits associated with psychopathy were, in any meaningful sense, especially happy, since happiness itself, as modern psychology generally understands it, depends on a complex combination of factors extending well beyond social reward or the absence of institutional constraint, and no reliable evidence exists regarding the actual subjective emotional experience of any medieval individual, whatever their underlying psychological profile. What the argument explored throughout this account actually supports is a considerably more limited and precise claim that the particular social, political, and cultural structure of medieval Europe, and especially of its warrior and ruling classes, happened to create conditions under which specific traits associated with psychopathy were more likely to translate into social status, material success, and freedom from serious institutional consequences than those same traits typically produce within the very different structures of most modern societies. This distinction matters considerably, since it shifts the genuine historical and psychological question away from any speculative claim about medieval happiness, which remains fundamentally unanswerable from the available evidence, and toward a more genuinely answerable question about medieval social structure itself, namely which particular human traits a given society's institutions, culture, and distribution of power tend to reward, and they tend to constrain. Understood this way, the medieval case offers a genuinely valuable historical illustration of a broader and continuously relevant principle, that the social consequences facing any particular pattern of human personality and behavior depend enormously on the specific structure of the society within which that person happens to live, a principle with clear and ongoing relevance well beyond the particular historical case of medieval Europe itself. Chapter 12. What the medieval case teaches us today. The exploration of why psychopathic traits may have found a more accommodating environment within medieval society than they generally find today ultimately illuminates a broader truth about the relationship between individual psychology and social structure, one with genuine relevance extending well beyond the specific historical case this account has examined. Modern societies have developed institutional structures, including independent judicial systems, professional and ethical oversight, broader public education regarding manipulation and exploitation, and cultural norms that increasingly value transparency and accountability, specifically designed, whether consciously or as an incidental effect of broader social development, to constrain exactly the kind of ruthless, unaccountable exercise of power that medieval social structure permitted with considerably greater latitude. This does not mean that modern institutions have eliminated the social and professional advantage that traits associated with psychopathy can still confer in certain contexts, a subject that contemporary psychological research continues to examine within modern settings, including corporate, leadership, and political life, but it does suggest that the particular combination of weak institutional accountability, a warrior culture that actively celebrated ruthlessness and fearlessness as virtue, and a religious framework offering a ready mechanism for social absolution without requiring genuine emotional reckoning, created conditions within medieval Europe that were, in certain identifiable and historically specific ways, unusually well suited to reward exactly the traits that modern psychology associates with the psychopathic personality profile, a conclusion that tells us less about any individual medieval person's inner happiness than it does about the profound and continuing influence that a society's underlying structure exerts over which human traits ultimately flourish within it. Thank you for listening. See you in the next stories. Please subscribe and leave a comment.